Hello, thank you for joining us for this video training today on Cardinal Scale's ID storage mode of operation. My name is Amos Carrick. I work with our engineering team here at Cardinal Scale, and today we're going to be looking at 3 different indicators so we can see what the ID storage process looks like 3 different ways. We're going to start with our most simple version of ID storage, which is on our 210 weight indicator. Then we're going to look at the 225 indicator, which adds a lot of features, and it's a system that we've used for many years and it's worked really well for us. And then we're going to look at the 825, which builds upon what the 225 does and gives us some other really cool features as well. So with all that being said, let's get started. So before we look at the indicators themselves, let's talk about what ID storage is. So ID is some sort of identifier. It's numbers, letters, or some combination of the two. And there's information that's associated with that ID. And that's what we do, is we store that information in the system. And there are different types of ID storage. For example, like our 225 has, I believe it's the digital field control, where you can store IDs and store target weights and things like that. We're not talking about that kind of ID storage today. This topic is, most commonly, this system is used for weighing, let's say, trucks. A truck may come onto the scale, weigh, leave the scale, either get loaded or unload, come back to the scale and get a second weight. So that ID in the system is stored between the first weight and the second weight. That's the kind of ID storage we're talking about today. So there are different situations where this type of ID storage can be used. As I mentioned, weighing trucks is a very common application. Rail cars, weighing rail cars works very similar. I've also had people use it for weighing something like a laundry cart, where they had there was several laundry carts that this company had. Each one had an associated tare weight with it, which we'll get into in a little bit. But they were able to recall an ID, and associate, in that case, laundry carts with IDs instead of trucks and rail cars. Taking a look at general features of ID storage, I've already mentioned 1 or 2 of them. So without ID storage, in order to get a net weight of product in a container, the user has to put the container on the scale, press the tare button, and then add material to that container. And then we can then have a gross weight, a tare weight, and a calculated net weight. With ID storage, this can be done in 2 separate steps. The benefits of this are we can have multiple trucks, again using the truck example, multiple trucks with first pass weights at a time, and then they can come back in different orders. We can actually weigh, the first weight can be the heavy weight instead of the first weight having to be the tare weight. So things like that are advantages of using ID storage over just pressing the tare button. An example of that is, personally, I used to work at a feed store, and at that feed store, part of what that facility does is sell bulk feed. And that company had 2 trucks at that location, 2 bulk feed trucks, and a truck would come around onto the scale and weigh empty. We would press the tare button, and then that truck would leave and then come back and weigh later, which worked fine for the process. However, the disadvantage was the other truck couldn't start weighing yet until the first truck was completed. So there were times where it would have been handy to have both trucks with their first pass weights completed. But that's one of the things that is a definite benefit of ID storage. With a temporary ID, again, using an example of a truck may come onto the scale, and if there's not a permanent ID stored in the system for that truck, it can be assigned a temporary ID. The truck can weigh the first time, the truck comes back on the scale, and when it weighs the second time, we recall the ID that was used on the first pass, but then the system forgets that ID exists. It's just temporary. It's only there to get through the second pass weight. We also have the ability to store permanent IDs, and we have that capability in all three of the indicators we'll talk about today. But with the permanent ID, that ID for the truck, the laundry cart, the rail car, the whatever the container is, can have an accumulator associated with it and a number of loads associated with it. And so that number can be used over and over and over again and have additional information associated with it. So, like I said, the first indicator we're going to look at today is the Model 210. So before we look and see some of the operation on the 210, I want to go through a few of the basic features of the 210, kind of what makes it different from the other indicators we'll be looking at today. So one of the things is the 210 has a single ID field. And so that means that we can just put in the truck number or the rail car number or again, a laundry cart number, whatever that container is, whatever that vessel is, we just have one ID field. When entering that into the 210, it can be up to 6 digits long. The 210 display only has 6 digits, so that's as much as we can use for a 210. Most of the time when the customers, at least that I've spoken to, use the 210, they use just digits, so just numbers. However, we do have the ability to use alphanumeric characters. However, as we'll see in a moment, the letters are kind of, I like to say, nostalgic, to put a positive spin on it, but they are a little cumbersome to enter. But we will see that, and again, numbers generally work better for a 210. So the ID storage can have additional benefits if we add a USB-A option card, so Cardinal Scale's 2XX-USB-A option card. And those things are this. So one, and I didn't put it on the slide, but we can plug in a really basic keyboard. So as I mentioned, if somebody wants to use alphanumeric characters for the IDs, if they plug in the USB-A option card, plug in a keyboard, they can actually type on the keyboard just like you type on a computer keyboard. So it makes that kind of ID entry easier. Also, the standard 210 can store up to 25 in-process IDs. So that's individual IDs. So again, using the example of trucks, that's 25 individual trucks that are in process at any one time. If we have the USB-A option card installed, we have the capability to expand that up to 200 IDs. So it gives us a lot more storage. If it's a bigger facility, things like that, they may need more trucks. Just really gives us some good capability there. The other thing, and we'll talk about it more when we talk about the 225, but the USB-A option card allows us to store transactions on a USB drive, thumb drive, however you want to refer to it. And then we can take that information, put it in the PC, and open up Cardinal Scale's PC companion software. And it actually gives us a really easy way to take that transaction information and put it in a database that can be viewed on the PC, can run reports off of it, daily reports, things like that. So that's another thing that the USB-A option card does allow us to do. So now we're going to transition and actually see what the process looks like on the 210 indicator. The first example we're going to show on the 210 weight indicator with the ID storage is using a temporary ID. In this case, we're going to use ID number 1. And as I mentioned before, with the temporary IDs, once I do the second pass weighment with ID number 1, the system will essentially forget that ID exists. It's only temporary. To use this ID number, we're going to put weight on the scale. I'm going to press the function key. And notice the display says ID equals. And with the other indicators, we'll see that prompt is changeable. With the 210, it will just say ID. And that's the same whether it's a truck, a rail car, or anything that we're weighing. So I pressed function, and now I enter the ID number, in this case using ID 1. And then to print the first pass ticket, I just press print. And it prints a ticket. In this case, I have it set to show the time, date, the ID number, and the weight that was on the scale. You may have also noticed the display briefly said pass 1. That acts as a confirmation to the scale operator that it was indeed the first time that ID was used. So in this case, we will remove the weight from the scale. So it was 3,000 pounds for the first weight. We're going to put more weight on the scale. In this case, we're going to add more weight. So this time it's 5,000 pounds. And the process to use that ID is the same. So we press function, 1, and print. Notice the display said pass 2, which is a good sign. It was looking for the second time for that ID to be used, and that's what we saw. The weight ticket shows the time, date, and an ID, the ID 1, and then it also has the gross, tare, and net weights. The first pass was the lighter of the two weights, so next to the tare weight, the weight ticket says inbound. Then one of the nice things about ID storage, as I believe I mentioned earlier, if the first pass were to have been the heavier weight, then it would say inbound by the gross weight. The system does not care if the first weight is heavy or the lighter of the two weights. It still makes the net calculation based off of whatever the two weight values are. And next we're going to demonstrate a weight ticket that uses a permanent ID with a stored tare weight. In this case, we're going to use ID TRK5. So I'm going to put weight on the scale. And I happen to know that my stored tare weight for TRK5 is 2,500 pounds. So I'm going to go above that. So now our weight on the scale is 4,000 pounds. So we're going to start the process the same way we did earlier. So function, it says ID. And now to do TRK5, notice we only have number characters over here, but the numbers each have letters on them. So similar to early cell phones, sending text messages and things like that, in order to use the T, I have to press the number 8 key twice. So T, so for R, I'll press 7 4 times. And then the K is on the number 5. I promise that is supposed to be a K. We can only do so many things with the 7-segment displays, which is one downfall of using the 210. This screen limits us to be able to make these letters human readable. And then since I paused for a moment, I can now press the number 5 and it'll give me a 5. Now I can press print. And notice that was the first time I used that ID, but the screen said pass 2. That's because we had a stored tare weight associated with that ID. And on the printed ticket, it shows time, date, the ID, and a gross, tare, and net weight. In this case, the tare weight says manual weight next to it. That's just saying that the truck, in this case, or whatever the container is, was not weighed on the scale, but that weight was manually entered sometime before. TRK5 was an example of a permanent ID. I also want to look and I want to show you how to set up and edit a permanent ID. It has some other good information in there as well. So to do that, we press the asterisk key, the display says function, then we press the function key, and it prompts for an ID. So we're not using this to weigh a truck at this point, we're using it to set up the ID. In this case, I want to set up ID 5, which is already in the system. I press enter, and it asks for tare. If we do want to use a stored tare weight, I press enter, we would enter that here. So ID number 5 currently has a stored tare weight of 5,000 pounds. If we leave this value at 0, then we would need to use the permanent ID just as we did the temporary IDs. So the truck would have to be weighed 2 separate times. The difference is, as I mentioned before, the permanent IDs would then have weights accumulated with them and also accumulated number of loads. So this says accum, and this is where we see that information. So the times I've used ID number 5, it has added up to 19,082 pounds. Enter again the number of loads. So that ID has been used 7 times. I press enter and it goes back to live weight. So before we move on to the 225, I want to take a look at the 210 weight ticket itself. So up on the screen now, you can see the top line shows the time and the date and the ID and the gross weight at the top. So this screen shows the first pass ticket at the top and the same weighment, but the second pass on the bottom. You'll notice the first 3 lines are the same information. So on the second ticket, it also has the time and date on the first line, and then the ID on the next line, and then the gross weight on the third line. Notice the weights are different, but that's because in this case, the tare weight, or the lighter of the 2 weights, was the first weight, so it puts it down on the tare line instead of keeping it on the gross line. That is one thing with the 210. We do have user configurable weight tickets. We can lay these out differently. However, using the print tabs of the 210, the first and second pass weight tickets are the same. So now we're going to take a look at the Model 225 weight indicator. As we'll see rather quickly, there are several additions to the 225, several additional benefits, I should say, over the 210. And the whole process is going to look much different than it does in the 210. One of the main differences is in the 225, we can have up to 3 ID fields. So with the 210, it was just the truck or just the rail car or just the whatever the container is. With the 225, we're able to have 3 different fields, so we can have maybe a truck and a trailer and a product. In the examples we're looking at today, I have them set up to be a truck, a product, and a customer. These things, as I mentioned, are user configurable. You can change the names, so it doesn't have to just say ID1, ID2, ID3. It can say things like truck and product and customer, which again, we'll see in a moment. With the 225, our IDs can be up to 12 characters long. Still alphanumeric characters, letters and numbers. Really nice thing on the 225 is we have the full QWERTY keyboard, so we don't have to do the little tricky stuff pushing the letters on like we did on the 210. The other nice thing is when you're entering IDs on a 225, as they show up on the display, a K, like we saw earlier on the 210, it didn't look much like a K. Actually, it looks like a K on the 225. The display on the 225 allows us to have that kind of flexibility and kind of clarity. We saw on the 210 towards the end that the ticket layout was the same for the first and second pass. The 225 gives us the configurability to have a completely different layout for the first pass and the second pass. This allows us to have maybe information printing on a pre-printed ticket where the first pass information needs to go in one place and the second pass information needs to go in a completely different place on the weight ticket. We mentioned that the 210 has up to 25 IDs standard straight out of the box. With the 225, we have 200. That's also expandable using the USB-A option card. Now we have the same capabilities, like I mentioned, the external keyboard. We have the expanded IDs, which on the 225 go from 200 standard up to virtually unlimited. I say virtually because eventually we would run out of space on a USB drive or a micro SD card, but it is far more IDs than anybody would realistically ever need to have in the system at one time. And as we will see, we'll demonstrate towards the end of the 225 section here, we do also have the ability to use the PC companion. So we have the ability to take those IDs, or those transactions rather, put them on a USB drive, and then put them in the PC to be able to run reports, things like that off of. An interesting feature that I really like about the 225 that in my opinion is underutilized is each ID can have what's called a reference field. So a really good example is, let's say a company is selling some sort of seed or some sort of feed. And in this case, let's say they have soybeans as one of their products. So we can have it set up, and that's actually how I have my 210 here, or 225 rather, how I have it set up. We can punch in the product number 10, but then on the weight ticket, it'll actually say number 10, but then it can also say soybeans. So something that may need to be entered easier, but then on the ticket, it will show the actual something that's more human readable, that makes more sense to somebody that may not know what that product number is. And that is a feature that is available only using permanent IDs. So temporary IDs, it's limited on what we have stored. It's usually just the primary ID, which in many cases is the truck, and then the stored weight associated with that. With the permanent IDs, we have more information, in this case, like a reference field. And so now let's take a look and see what the process looks like on the 225 and see how different it is from what we saw on the 210. For our first example using the 225 weight indicator, we're going to use a temporary ID. In this case, we're going to use ID number 1. So we're going to start as if a truck pulls on the scale. And this time I'm going to make the first weight the heavier of the two weights. So it's about 80,000 pounds. To enter the ID, I press the ID soft key, and you'll notice on the screen, instead of saying ID, it says truck equals. So this is an example of being able to change the prompts in the 225. We can make it say truck, we can make it say rail car, say laundry, whatever the information is that we want to display there. So in this case, it's truck number 1. So I press 1. And I have a couple of options here. I can just use the truck ID, and if I press print, it will take my inbound weight. If I press enter, it will take me to the next ID field prompt. So that's what I want to do. I'm going to press enter. Now the display says product equals. So in this case, I want to use product number 10. I'm going to press enter. And on the screen, briefly, it showed ref equals soybeans. So using the reference fields I mentioned earlier, that can be a confirmation to somebody entering the data that they entered the right ID. Now the display says customer, and we're just going to use customer 789. This is the last ID field. If I press print, it will print a first pass weight ticket. If I press enter, it will store the information without printing a first pass ticket. In this case, I'm going to press print. Notice the display briefly said print pass 1. So like with the 210, it's a confirmation that that's the first time that ID was used in a weighman. To do the second pass, we're going to demonstrate the weight alarm in this instance also. The weight alarm is a feature that was not shown in the 210, but it is a feature of the 210, and not just the 225. So you'll see down here, I have just an LED set to light up. What the weight alarm does is it allows a scale that maybe is not always attended, or somebody's not always watching the scale. If a driver pulls on the scale, it can notify somebody, let's say in an office situation, that they need to come and process the truck. So in this case, we'll say the truck pulls on the scale. Notice the weight alarm comes on. And I have it set for 5 seconds, and it just goes off. This can be set to be just a visual alarm, such as this one. It can be set for an audible alarm, or it can be set for both. All the 225 does is it engages an output, and that can go to, again, an audible alarm, a visual alarm, or a combination of the two. So right now we have about 50,000 pounds on the scale. Again, the first pass was the heavier of the two weights, and this is the lighter of the two weights. So we're going to press ID, soft key. Again, it says truck equals. Going to re-enter ID number 1. print. The bottom of the screen said print past 2, and then it said accumulating. So it's adding the weights to the accumulators like we talked in the 210 for that ID. For our second example on using ID storage in the 225, we're going to use a permanent ID. So we're going to start acting as if a truck pulls on the scale. Let's say it weighs about 50,000 pounds. Entering the ID is the same as it was on the temporary IDs. So we're going to press ID. And this time I want to use TRK5. So TRK5. Notice that was much easier to enter than it was on the 210. And with this example, I want to skip the product and customer prompts. So in order to do that, from here, instead of pressing enter, I press print. The bottom of the display says print past 2, then accumulating. So again, the print past 2 confirms that that's a second pass weighment, which is what we expected because this ID has a stored tare weight associated with it. And then it prints the weight ticket. So if we, as we mentioned, the permanent IDs have loads and weight accumulators associated with them. So let's see what that looks like. So if we press the mem key, it asks for an ID. This is also where we set up our permanent IDs. So this can be the products. We can set up permanent IDs for customers or trucks in the examples we're using here. In this case, I want to see what ID TRK5 has associated with it. So at TRK5, if this ID was not currently in the system, it would create the ID at this time. I press enter. It asks for the reference information. In this case, I do not want a reference associated with this truck. Press enter. And this is where we would change the tare weight. So let's say the tare weight needs to be 30,000 pounds. I change that, press enter. Now it says the weight, pounds, and accum. So the accumulator is 166,000 pounds. Press enter. And it's been over the course of 5 loads. I press enter, and it goes back to the main screen and is ready to process a truck. Now we're going to take a look at the PC Companion software. When you first open PC Companion, this is the screen that you see. What we have here is a list of all of the records that have been imported so far into the PC Companion. These records are stored in a database on the PC, just a very simple database that can be populated here. The first thing we want to show is importing transactions that were being stored onto the 225 using the USB-A option card on a USB drive. Right now, I have that same USB drive installed in the PC. So to import these, I go up to Actions, Import from USB. It lists all of the USB drives that are currently in the PC. And in this case, we just have the one, the D drive. I click it and click Start Transfer. It says Import Results. We have 8 identifiers updated and 9 transactions imported. The identifiers are the IDs that we have been talking about. We'll see more of that in a moment. Click OK, I click Done, and you'll notice as soon as I exited that screen, we have more transactions that display on this screen in PC Companion. The headers are selectable, so I can go up to where this grid is, and I can choose which fields I want to select. So there's the net weight, I can take it off of my list, and I can add it to the list. I can do that with any of the fields. You'll notice down here we have truck 5, and then another truck 5, and another truck 5. That was one of our IDs that we were storing permanently. You'll notice with this, ID number 5 was used. The gross weight was 30,140 pounds. And then here, the same weight is the tare, 30,140. This was the first pass weighment. This was the second pass weighment. You'll notice that the first pass weighment was not given a consecutive number, but the second pass weighment was. So no consecutive number, and this one does have a consecutive number. You'll also notice that it stores the reference fields as well. So in the example, we used ID number 10 for the product ID, and it populated soybeans as the reference field. We also have the ability to view the IDs that are stored on the USBA option card. So click there and click identifiers. Here are the IDs stored on the option card. So here's TRK5, which we used in an example, number 5, which we used in an example, and some other ones that were used on the 225 before using this video. We won't go into details here, but we do have the ability to add IDs. We can click this plus sign, enter the ID, enter a tare weight, reference information, and save that. That can then be exported and used back on the indicator. Back on the transaction screen, we have the ability to run reports. That's a really nice function of PC Companion, this free software that is able to run basic reports off of transaction information. To do that, we go up and select View and Reports. And there are 3 options. And we're going to use the top one, which is Simple Transaction Log for multiple IDs. I select that. We could use a date filter, the previous month, custom dates, things like that. For now, we're just going to click Generate Report. And here we have a nice printable record of all of the transactions that were in the list we saw a moment ago. This is something that can be saved as a PDF, it can be printed to a printer, whatever is needed for the operation to use this information later on. On the screen now, you can see an example of an inbound and outbound 225 weight ticket. You'll notice the inbound weight on top, or inbound ticket on top, shows the time on the first line, the date on the next line, and then the truck below that. What I want to distinguish here is the first and second pass have different ticket formats. So the easiest way to see this is on the second pass. The first line has the time and date both on it instead of them being on separate lines. And then also on the second pass, it then populates the truck, product, and customers. It also includes the reference fields for product and customer on the second pass, where it did not put any of that information on the first pass. Moving on to the Model 825 weight indicator, we'll see that the process looks even more different than it did in the 225. So with the 825, one of the key differences is instead of just being a selectable mode of operation, it's an actual application that we go into. In the end, it's the same idea, but there is a selection in order to be able to get into the application itself. One of the big differences is the 825 has up to 4 ID fields. 210 had 1, 225 had 3, the 825 has up to 4 that can be used. The touchscreen interface, which we'll see in the demonstration, also gives us a really nice way to input IDs and select IDs and all that good stuff. Each individual ID in the 825 can be up to 10 characters long. And as with the 225, the alpha characters, those letters, are easier to enter because we have the full keyboard on the 825. With the 825, all of the IDs are stored on the 825 itself. And the 825 has quite a bit of memory storage compared to the 225 and 210. So straight out of the box, the 825 has virtually unlimited IDs, number of IDs it can support and store at any one time. The 825 also has the ability to communicate with PC Companion. So with the 210 and 225, in order to do that, we had a USB-A option card installed in the indicator. With the 825, you go into the menu of the application and do an export. So instead of having the CSV file generated with the USB in the indicator, the 825, you put the USB in and then export them, all the transactions at one time. So the capability is still there, just the process looks a little different. Looking at the operation of the 825, as I mentioned, it looks quite a bit different than the other indicators do. A lot of that is attributed to the touchscreen display on the 825. So let's get right into it. Let's use a temporary ID. I'm going to put weight on the scale. Let's say 50,000 pounds. And you'll see on the display, there are 4 boxes down here labeled truck, product, customer, and job. Those are our ID fields. So if we push truck, it gives us a list of trucks that are currently in the system. Some of these may be temporary IDs. You'll notice the very first one has an asterisk and 7. That asterisk signifies that it's a temporary ID, not one that's permanently in the system. So ID 7 could be recalled as a temporary ID. The other ones without the asterisk are all permanent stored IDs. At the bottom, we have 2 buttons. One says exit, the other one says other. The other is what we press to enter a temporary ID. So now at the top it says temporary truck and then asks for the ID. So I'm going to use ID number 1. Press enter. If I wanted to use products, customers, or jobs, I can enter those as well. So if I do product, I can select calf feed. Notice I don't have to key in the permanent ID because it's already in the system. So I can just press where it says calf feed. And as long as everything is correct on the display, I press print. So on the other 2 indicators, it would ask, or it would just say pass 1 or pass 2. With the 825, it asks a confirmation. So is this first pass in? I know this is the first time that I'm using this ID, so I know that this is correct, so I press yes. An interesting feature of the 825 is it has the ability to put the printed weight ticket on the display. We have this because of the graphic capabilities of the 825 display. So at this time, we normally would have printed a weight ticket, but we can also have it display here so you can see at the top we have the date and the time in all of the IDs that have been enabled. And then at the bottom we have the first pass weight. So when we're done looking at this, we just press done. Gives us a message to reweigh on the second pass to finish. The weight leaves the scale. We'll put weight back on the scale. We'll just do 30,000 pounds this time. I press truck. And notice the very top left selection says asterisk 1. So again, the asterisk means it's a temporary ID, and that's ID number 1, which is the one we are looking for. I select that via the touchscreen. The 825 will show the gross, tare, and net weights for that ID. So you'll notice if I change the weight, it changes the changes the tare and the net weight. Also, you'll notice the product was automatically populated. So if there was a mistake and I need to go in and change it, I can press product and I can change it to hog feed instead. When all of the information is correct, press print, confirmation that this is a second pass out, which it is. And now it shows the full ticket. Again, if we had a printer connected, it would print the ticket as well. So it shows the out time and date, the in time and date. So it shows the time and date for both passes. The truck, the product, and then the gross, tare, net at the bottom. When I'm finished with this, I press done. The transaction is complete. The scale is emptied, and and it's ready for another weighment. Now let's take a look at the use of a permanent ID. So we'll put quite a bit of weight on the scale, about 80,000 pounds. I select the truck, and in this case I'm going to use truck ABC123. So I just press that. It had a stored tare weight associated with it, so it automatically brings up a gross tare and net. You'll also notice that it went ahead and populated the hog feed product and the customer as Joe. With the 825, we have the ability to associate the secondary IDs with the primary ID. So in this case, all the transactions are tracked by the truck ID as the primary ID, but we can have, again, the other IDs associated to that truck. So we know that every time truck ABC123 is used, it's always hauling hog feed, and it's always for Joe, the customer. As long as all of this information is correct, I press the print key, transaction complete, and it would print a weight ticket if we had it set up. So the next thing we want to look at is how to enable and set up the permanent IDs. To do this in the 825, I press the menu button, and I want to look at a truck ID. So I'll press the truck IDs button. I have to log in using the admin login of the 825. So here I can add a new truck, edit an existing truck, delete them, all kinds of things like that. So in this case, I want to edit a truck ID. And I want to edit 123XYZ. So with this permanently stored ID, I can have an RFID badge associated with it. So instead of pushing the buttons on the 825, we can just swipe a badge. I have a stored tare weight associated with it. And this is where we also set up the associated product and customer and a job if we were to do so. The ones I want to draw attention to are at the bottom, where we have the number of loads and the accumulated net weight, just like we had on the 210 and the 225. When we're done with this screen, we just press the Done button, and then Exit, Exit, and we're back into the main weight screen ready to process another truck. The last thing I want to show is how to do the PC Companion export. To do that, we go into the menu, and there's a PC Companion button. We touch it. It says this will delete completed transactions. And we select OK. Then it asks to insert flash drive and press OK. If we were doing the export, I would insert a USB into the 825, press OK. And what it does is it generates a CSV file that PC Companion can understand. And then again, as it prompted us a moment ago, it does delete all of the transaction records from the 825. This keeps from having duplicate records transferred to PC Companion later on. So we looked and saw a couple of sample weight tickets show up on the 825 display when we were doing the examples. One thing I want to point out that we didn't show on those is the 825 also has the ability to use headers and footers on the weight tickets. So we can actually go in and put several lines of header text. So like on the screen now, you can see these sample tickets were for Joe's Rock Yard, and it has an address, and then it has a phone number, and then at the bottom there's a couple lines of a footer. It says, "Thank you for your business. Come see us again." And also I want to point out on the first pass ticket, which is there on the right, it has a different header and footer than the second pass ticket does. So those are set up independently in the 825. If we were to do something like this with the 210 or the 225, we would have to use a custom ticket generated with the in-control software. That concludes our talk today with the ID storage application. So we looked at the 210, 225, and 825, and hopefully you can see quite a bit of difference in those three indicators. If If you have any more questions on how this ID storage operates or the different functions between the 3 indicators, please call our tech support at 866-254-8261.